This is the xDuoo MT-602, a headphone amplifier with a hybrid tube and solid-state circuitry with a Class A circuit design. I've never tried out a tube amp before, so I'm pretty excited about this one. Tubes bring to mind evocative words like warm, rich, smooth. But is that always true? Well, let's get into it. Hey guys, this is Noel and this is Wheezy Tech, and on this channel I take a look at a thing and let you know what I think, so if you're into that kind of stuff then make sure you subscribe. Hitting on that notification bell, that also helps out too. Now in the interest of full disclosure, the xDuoo MT-602 was sent to me by Hifi Go. Hifi Go are an online audio store selling all kinds of stuff from earphones to headphones to amps and DACs. Hifi Go provided no compensation, nor did they have any input in this review. They're going to be seeing this for the first time, the same as you guys. I've not been paid to say anything positive, and as always, I'm going to give you my honest take. Also, as usual, there will be timestamps in the description if you want to skip to any specific section. And with all of that said, let's just get on with it. First up, xDuoo. I'm going to be calling it xDuoo. I'm not sure if it's xDuoo or xDuoo or what, but I'm going to be calling it xDuoo. If someone wants to correct me in the comments, then go on ahead. The xDuoo MT-602 is a compact little headphone amplifier. Width is just shy of the JDS Atom, but it is a fair bit shorter in depth. The actual dimensions are 12 centimeters wide, 8 centimeters deep, and 4 centimeters high, not including any of the knobs, switches, and the RCA jacks. The tubes themselves protrude 2 centimeters above the top of the chassis. The chassis itself appears to be made entirely of metal, with holes drilled in the sides and in a pattern around the tubes for cooling. This is important as in use the MT-602 does get very hot. This is in part due to the tubes and also likely in part due to the Class A circuit design. Looking at the front panel, we have the xDuoo logo in the top left, and moving from left to right we have the power switch. This is a toggle switch with a really satisfying click engagement. I really love toggling this little switch on and off. It's got this really satisfying click that I really like. The orientation of this switch is the opposite of what I would expect, with up being on and down being off. Moving right, and the next features are the headphone outputs. There are both 6.35mm or 1/4 inch and 3.5mm jacks. Both seem to be the same with the same full power output. Moving further right, we have the anodized red aluminium volume knob. The volume pot itself is very smooth with a good resistance to it. One thing I really hate is a sloppy volume pot like the spongy thing on the Topping L30. This pot on the MT-602 feels absolutely perfect. Finally, on the far right we have a 3.5mm aux input. There is another input on the rear. This one is a pair of RCA jacks, and alongside this is a pair of aux output RCA jacks. This is for the line output of the amp. Over on the right we have the power input for connecting the included power supply, and unlike a lot of other headphone amplifiers, this one takes 12V DC rather than the more commonly used 15V AC. Before we continue, pay attention to the logos at the bottom. We have the CE and FCC certification logos, so you can be sure that this amp conforms to US and EU standards. Finally, a quick look at the bottom, and we have 4 rubber feet to stop the amp from slipping. The unit itself has a good weight to it, and it does stay put much better than the rather lightweight JDS Atom. Let's talk tubes, or valves as we call them in good old Blighty. I'm probably going to use the word tube and valve interchangeably in this review. I know the bulk of my audience is in the US, but we call them valves over here in the UK, and I'm just too old-fashioned and stuck in my ways to change. The MT-602 uses the Chinese 6J1 tube, which is a standard design that is also known by other names such as 6AK5 in the US and EF95 in the EU, as well as other names in other territories, so replacements shouldn't be too difficult to find. Some say that valves need to be burned in, and some say that they do not. If you speak to musicians such as guitarists, they will tell you that burn-in is not necessary. However, it seems like the majority of hi-fi people feel the opposite way, so I'm gonna say do whatever makes you feel happy. That particular debate is not within the scope of this review, but for the sake of clarity, I used this amplifier solidly for a month before sitting down to write this review and do my proper listening tests, so whatever your stance on burn-in, you can consider these tubes burned in. It should probably be noted that vacuum tubes have a shelf life much like an old school incandescent bulb. For as long as they are powered on, they are in a state of deterioration until they inevitably fail. It is generally accepted that valves should be swapped out on a regular basis, some say every year, but they should actually last much longer before dying. But it is possible that as the tubes degrade, they will start to have more and more of an effect on the sound. The MT-602 uses vacuum tubes only in its preamp stage. For the output stage, it uses a solid-state circuit design. Both vacuum tubes and transistors perform the same function in that they are used to amplify a signal. Vacuum tubes are a much older technology that has in most cases been replaced by transistors. So why use valves at all? Well, partly for the sake of nostalgia, partly because they look cool, and because they can impart an audible character or coloration to the sound that they amplify that some people consider to be subjectively pleasing. But do vacuum tubes always impart coloration or flavour on the sound that they amplify? Well, no, at least not always to a noticeable effect, especially in hybrid amplifier designs such as the MT-602. In full valve OTL amps, this effect can be quite noticeable, and many enthusiasts enjoy experimenting with various different valve types to tune their amplifier's sound to their own tastes. However, with hybrid designs where the tube is used only in the preamp stage, which has a much smaller impact, the effect can be much less noticeable. In fact, in many cases, a valve used in a hybrid design imparts no flavour at all and is virtually indistinguishable from a fully solid-state design. Jason Stoddard of Shit Audio himself admitted that he struggles to tell the difference between their Valley hybrid tube amp and their much better measuring Magny solid-state amplifier. As to whether the tubes in the MT-602 add any colour to the sound, well, you're just going to have to wait until the sound section. But before we get on to the sound section, we have a bit more to talk about with the operation of this amp and its quirks, because it does have a few quirks. First up, let's talk about the power output, which is rated for a max continuous output of 1.3 watts at 32 ohms, although the spec sheet doesn't state what kind of voltage or current it can provide at this wattage. However, 1.3 watts is quite a lot of power for a headphone amp, and should be more than enough for the vast majority of headphones that anyone is ever going to want to run off of an amplifier like this. I'm not going to be testing this with some exotic power-hungry headphones. Firstly, I don't own any. Secondly, I highly doubt that someone with those kinds of headphones is looking at amplifiers in this price range. Instead, I did all of my testing with the usual sub £200 or $200 mid-tier or mid-fi headphones, such as the HD6XX, the DT880 Pro 600 ohm, the HD560S, and I also did some testing with the Hifi Sundara. The MT-602 drives them all with ease, including the DT880 Pro 600 ohm. I mean, even the JDS Atom at 1 watt has enough continuous power to drive the 880 Pro to 115 dB SPL. Comfortable volume with the 880s on the MT-602 was at the 12 o'clock position, leaving plenty of headroom. My big complaint with the power output is actually the lack of any gain selection. Unlike the JDS Atom, which has both normal and high gain modes, the MT-602 is locked to one gain setting. Unfortunately, this makes the volume pot very sensitive when using less power-hungry headphones or IEMs. This is compounded by the fact that the volume pot itself has a fair amount of channel imbalance, especially at the low end of the volume pot. Channel imbalance at the low end of a volume pot is very, very common and exists in most headphone amplifiers. However, this does seem to be a bit worse than the average. Channel balance changes throughout the range of the pot, with a left side bias at the low end, balancing out at the 12 o'clock position, and then changing to a right side bias past 12 o'clock. Audibly, the channel imbalance is only really noticeable under around the 9 o'clock position. The problem is that because the amp is locked to a single high gain mode, the pot goes from very quiet to very loud very quickly. For headphones like the Beyerdynamic DT880 Pro 600 ohm, this is completely fine, as comfortable listening levels are at the 12 o'clock position, which is the perfect spot for channel balance. However, for other headphones where a comfortable listening level is around the 10 o'clock position and channel imbalance is noticeable up to 9 o'clock, you have little to no room for adjustment. And this also makes the xDuoo MT-602 effectively unusable for sensitive IEMs. Again, channel imbalance is quite common with volume pots, and not every manufacturer spends quite as much time as JDS Labs hand selecting volume pots to meet their strict standards. You could also work around this by turning the volume down in your playback software and then turning the amp up. However, this problem could have easily been negated with the inclusion of a gain selector switch, and it's a big shame that this feature is omitted on the MT-602. Next up, we need to talk about the line out, which also has its own annoying quirks. The line output is only active when the amplifier is switched on, and the output is volume controlled using the volume dial on the front. The problem is that the line output is not muted when the headphones are connected, and there is no separate switch to enable or disable the line out. This means that if you want to use the MT-602 as both a headphone amplifier and a speaker preamp, you will need to have a way to turn off your speakers when you want to listen to headphones. Some will find this more annoying than others. I personally have never used my amp as a preamp, so I always just run my speakers straight off of the DAC through a passive preamp. But it is something that I found odd, and I thought I should mention it. Now that we've finished talking about the line outputs, we should also turn our attention to the line inputs. There are RCA inputs on the rear and a 3.5mm aux input on the front. Both are always active and not switchable. That could be considered a negative, although perhaps some may prefer it this way. I'm not sure. I'm not going to pass judgment. I'm just going to say it is what it is. Another little quirk is that when turned on, the amplifier needs a few seconds, around 30 seconds, to warm up. After this wait period, a relay can be heard in the device and the amplifier is now ready to use. However, when this relay triggers, it causes a popping sound in the headphones. There is a thread from a user called Serious Apple on Audio Science Review which talks about this. The user suggests the problem is related to DC bias, with some instructions on how to adjust the amplifier to fix the problem. I've not done this myself, and it is possible that this fix will do the job. But I'm not reviewing a fix on a forum, I'm reviewing a device as it was shipped from the manufacturer, so as such, I do have to mention it. I don't know if any of these gripes, such as the popping, the channel balance, the lack of gain selection, the unswitched line inputs and pre-outs, are deal breakers on their own, but all of them could have been negated with different choices in the design process, and I feel that they do put a bit of a dampener on an otherwise good performing amplifier that I have actually been really enjoying using. But now that I've finished moaning about some of the odd design choices, let's talk about the MT-602's performance for actually listening to audio. Reviewing amplifiers and DACs is actually very difficult. I could just rattle off a bunch of subjective flowery words based on a month of using the amp as my daily driver. I can say things like warm, sweet, smooth, and people would just eat it up, as is evident by the number of posts saying pretty much the exact same thing on a certain site that rhymes with dreadfy. But in reality, the truth is rather more pedestrian. I do have a preconception in my mind of that tube sound, of that warmth and smooth analog experience. So how can I possibly go into this review and not be influenced by my ideas and my eyes? So I do what I always do when testing new amplifiers. It's totally not a scientific experiment, but it is more objective and the best I can do to try and remove all forms of bias. So I volume match my usual JDS Atom amp and the MT-602. I run them both off of the Atom DAC, both run through a switcher box. I mixed up the cables so I didn't know which was which, and I ran through a series of tests with various genres and a selection of headphones including the 6XX, the Sundara, and the DT880 600 ohm. It can't be understating just how important the volume matching is. Even slight differences in volume can be perceived as more or less detail. Louder always sounds better. The switching is also very important as echoic memory is incredibly short. A cited non-volume match test by physically switching between amps is not at all objective, and that's why I do blind volume match testing using the switcher. During these tests, I'm listening for 3 main criteria, and I'm also forcing myself to at least say something about them, make a call rather than just cop out and say that they both sound the same. I'm listening for coloration. Is there a tonal difference between these amps? Is one warmer, or leaner, or brighter? I'm looking for detail and dynamics. Is one more punchy or more detailed? And I'm also listening for sound staging. Is there a difference? Does one sound more open or more closed off? At the end, I then add up the results, and several times I was actually convinced that one was slightly warmer or had slightly better staging than the other. In the end, after listening to multiple tracks from classic rock to classical to electronic, to restarting the test and redoing the cabling multiple times, I looked at the results and I had said the exact same thing about both amplifiers 50% of the time. 50-50? That's the same as a coin toss. So whilst I have gone into the test with some preconceived ideas of how this amplifier should sound, I've actually come out of the test not able to actually hear this. Is it true that valves always add colour to the sound? Well, at least in my experience, it doesn't seem so. I should probably clarify that I'm not saying that the MT-602 has no tonal character, or that one or the other amplifier isn't more detailed or whatever. But I certainly didn't find any evidence to say that it does. Who knows, maybe with some seriously high-end headphones, the difference can be more obvious, although I don't know why one would spend thousands on a headphone and only $99 on an amp. It's also possible that my ears are not the right shade of gold, but that's what this channel is all about. The focus of this channel is cost-effective gear for ordinary people who like to use headphones to consume audio, whatever that audio may be. For me and the focus of this channel, the idea that this amp might, maybe, sound different on high-end headphones isn't relevant, as that's not how it's going to be used. Another thing to consider is, I suppose, that it's also possible that the sound could change over time as the tubes age and degrade. Obviously, I haven't got a time machine to test this, so maybe I'll do a follow-up in a year to see if anything has changed. I do think I say this same sort of thing for every amp or DAC that I review, and no doubt I'll get the usual comments about how wrong I am. I do feel like I'm the odd one out when I do this, as I am one of the few people prepared to actually challenge my ears with a blind volume match test, rather than just rattle off some subjective, flowery language. I do feel like I have heard differences between amps and DACs in the past. Incredibly tiny differences. And my conclusion has, to this day, always been that the differences between source gear are usually so tiny that it's irrelevant to the vast majority of people. I stand with my usual mantra: buy source gear for the features that you need, not the sound that you think it should have. Put your money in your headphones and earphones first, as ultimately they make the biggest difference to any setup. And actually, a good $100 amp like the xDuoo MT-602 is a great place to start with and should last you for quite a long time. I will say this, that the amp sounds great. It wins in all the areas that you want it to. There's no audible noise floor, there's no hissing, there's no crackling, there's no audible distortion, so it's doing its job very well. It does seem to be a very fine amplifier that has plenty of power, and I've really enjoyed using it this past month or so. So what is my conclusion? Well, the xDuoo MT-602 is a reasonably priced amplifier at $99. It has plenty of power and a good, clean sound. However, it is somewhat let down by the odd design choices such as the lack of gain switching, the lack of I/O switching, and the channel balance issues. The other problem for me is that at $99, it's also the same price as the JDS Atom and the Schiit Magni. However, neither of those have those cute little glowing tubes poking out of the top, and that fantastic little toggle switch that is so fun to click. I'll finish this review with this thought. In a world of digital media driven from computers, there's a lot to be said about tactility, and there's a certain enjoyment I get from turning this amp on with that satisfying click and watching the tubes warm up and glow that gentle orange colour. Too many people put all of their focus on the sound of an audio item. Beyond that being the main job of any audio gear, there is space for gear that is not the usual boring, soulless black box, and amplifiers with a little character, like the xDuoo MT-602, are most welcome additions in a sea of utilitarian designs. For all of my complaints, I have actually really enjoyed using this little amplifier. If xDuoo could address these complaints in a future revision, I'm sure they would be on to a real winner. Right, that's it from me. I hope you found this useful, interesting, or at least entertaining. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, etc, etc. And thank you to Hifi Go for sending this over to me for review. Make sure you go and check out their site. They do all kinds of hi-fi gear, from headphones to earphones, from amps to DACs, and so on. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.